guys, what's going on? Welcome to Serial at Midnight. My name is Heath, and in this video, we're going to talk about one of my favorite genres in all of film. We're going to talk about the Western. So if the Western is one of my favorite genres, why don't we talk more about it at Serial at Midnight? Well, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked. But it's because I think really the YouTube film community is not interested in Westerns, and that's kind of kept me away from it. But that's not a reason to not talk about Westerns. I think that, the film community on YouTube was really driven by the video store and later. So those of us who are my age and in their 40s and in their 50s, they remember the video store. And in the video store era, the Westerns, in the 50s, that was the heyday of the Westerns. Then the Western moved to TV. Then the Italians reinvented the Western with the spaghetti Western, kind of like pop operas. And then in the 70s, we kind of took a revisionist history, like a revisionist look about like, oh, well, the myth of the Western was a lot grittier and more sad and kind of horrible than it's been told through these heroic stories. And then the 70s were kind of that adjusting to like, oh, it was rough. And then in the 80s, it really kind of dropped off. And I'd say Westerns really as a cultural phenomenon ended in the 70s. We still get them, but they don't really have the cultural impact, the cachet that they did 50s, 60s, 70s. Westerns have been around forever, since the expansion westward in the United States. They're part of our collective. Here's the thing, the Westerns are a uniquely American genre. I think they are the only film genre or fiction genre that is completely and uniquely American, because they are our collective fantasy of the westward expansion. The settlers came, they settled in the East, and then they began to work their way through the West. And for a long time, that was a heroic tale because they braved the wilderness and they braved the savages. They overcame the savages. But I think as the reality of what actually happened became more and more apparent and we could deal with it, the truth behind that started to come out. And that's where those 70s revisionist Westerns came from. We're like, oh, we did horrible things. But it is nevertheless the story of America. For good, for bad, all of it. It's our story. And so there are Australian Westerns, and there are spaghetti Westerns, and there are Japanese Westerns, but the Western really originated and is at its purest form in the American, we're talking about movies, so the American studio system really is that pure Western. But I know that YouTubers traditionally, they're not interested in some of that stuff because it's way earlier than them. And we do continue to get comments and be like, these movies are older than I am. Well, most of what we watch is older than we are because we're exploring the past. And so there's a lot of ripe material for exploration. So what I have done, first of all, I want to thank Cinema Dave Media for encouraging this video, for giving me some feedback to make this video, because he said, no, there is an audience for you to talk about Westerns. And when I floated that idea out more publicly on YouTube, I got a lot of feedback saying we would love a Western video. So this is the Western video. And so here's the thing, I was looking in my database and I have hundreds of Westerns on DVD and Blu-ray. Like I said, it's one of my favorite genres. I just don't talk about it that much here because a lot of you guys just haven't seen these things, and again, that's not a reason not to talk about them, but that's just kind of how it's been. So there will be opportunities for more videos like this in the future, exploring the Western, exploring some of my favorite, maybe unseen picks. So what I've done is I've pulled a handful of titles to talk with you about. These are not going to be like your AFI top 100 Westerns of all time. I'm really... When you get into other people's lists, that's tricky territory because you're talking about other people. Like, there are things on these lists that I don't agree with. So I'm going to tell you things that I enjoy. And this is going to be perhaps controversial, maybe a little surprising. There are going to be things here that you're going to be like, I've never heard of this. They're not necessarily the most mind-blowing epic Westerns of all time. They're not necessarily Academy Award winners. These are my picks for Westerns that I love and that I want to talk with you about and share with you. So on that note, I am going to start at the top of the mountain and talk about a couple of movies from John Ford, who is, I think, not even arguably the master of the American Western. Going back to the silent days, John Ford was he came here and he made movies, and then by the time of the 60s, the 50s and the 60s, the Western from the golden age of Hollywood was this epic, the myth. There was this huge myth. And so there are two movies that I really want to highlight here. I'm going to start with The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which is from 1962. This is one of those movies that it really does have a commentary about the myth itself. It is a look at the myth of the West, how that myth is told. It's John Wayne, it's Jimmy Stewart, it's James Stewart. It is also Lee Marvin is in this, Edmund O'Brien. This is a really smart, it's a powerful movie. It really is. So I'm going to start with this one. This is one that I highly recommend you guys check out for a self-aware, it's not postmodern or anything like that, but it is a self-aware look that we are telling a myth and we are commenting on the myth. Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. But for the purest form of a John Ford Western, I think I and many others would recommend to you The Searchers, which is, again, John Wayne. Quick aside on John Wayne. I know that John Wayne is under fire these days for his very, very, very conservative opinions. I know that it's like Twitter outrage about John Wayne. We have to try to judge the work on the work itself. Judge the performances by the work itself. Because whoever we think John Wayne is, the movie tells a story of its own. And the character that he plays in here is not a hero. I don't want to rob you of the experience of The Searchers because I realize that a lot of you watching this video have not seen The Searchers yet. And you will have that in your future. So I don't want to tell you too much about it, but I will say the character of John Wayne in this movie is a strong, hard man. He has this, it's kind of like a search and rescue mission. There's a slaughter from this, the Native Americans, the Indians in this movie slaughter the settlement. And he goes looking for the one was taken. He goes looking for this one. The one is Natalie Wood, by the way. And he goes looking for this one. And it's kind of this sprawling, epic quest to find, to rescue this person, this girl. And it does not go the way you think that it's going to go. And who he is not who you think he is. And by the end of the movie, again, I'm not going to rob you of the experience, but by the end of the movie, he's not necessarily our hero. And it's a good commentary on people, on the flawed nature of people, on hate. This is a man consumed by hate, and the movie knows that he's consumed by hate, and they show the hate and what it has done. And the last shot of the movie, I feel like, is an homage. And that's not an homage. Another very famous movie. I'm walking on eggshells here because I don't want to rob anything from you guys. There's a very famous movie that I feel like directly takes its ending from the ending of this movie, and it is just one of the best Westerns ever. So that's the John Ford portion of this. And from there on, I think we're going to get kind of deep and kind of esoteric here. So I want to talk with you guys about the films of Buddecker. That's how you spell it, Buddecker. So these films, actually, this is how they should be, because this is first. These films are the Renown cycle, R-A-N-O-W-N, the Renown cycle. And they are some of the finest little Westerns that you are ever going to see. They were low budget. They were short. They're like an hour and 15, hour and 20, something like that. This one's 78 minutes. And Bud Buddecker had such a grasp of human nature and the morality. So all these Westerns, they have different plots, but they all feature these very visceral, very real situations. They're like nail biters. They're almost like noir films. And they're so well respected in the Western fan community. There's a documentary on 7 Men From Now. It's called Bud Buddecker, an American Original. And it features interviews with Tarantino, Robert Towne, Clint Eastwood, Taylor Hackford, Peter Bogdanovich, and Gretchen Wayne. And then on this set, in the special features, Martin Scorsese's talking about these movies. When he would go see these movies in the 50s as a kid, and he has thoughts to say. It's a shame Martin Scorsese has never made a Western, because I think he would really have done a good one. He knows the genre really well. But so here's the thing. This box set is out of print. This is not out of print, but we are in luck because Mill Creek Entertainment has released these 2 Randolph Scott collections. By the way, these movies all star Randolph Scott, who was... In the 30s and the 40s, Randolph Scott was one of those icons of the Western genre. He was also a leading man, but it was really the Western that he kind of became a household name, I want to say. Like, the Western is where he found a lot of work during the 40s and the 50s. Canadian Pacific, Western Union, things like that. So when the Buddecker movies went out of print, Mill Creek has stepped in, and there are these 2 Randolph Scott collections. And these, let's see, one of these, this collection particularly, this has 6 movies, and these all come from the 40s and the 50s. But this collection has the Buddecker films repressed. So they're back in print with Mill Creek. So it's The Tall T, Decision at Sundown, Buchanan Rides Alone, Ride Lonesome, and Comanche Station. You couple those films with 7 Men From Now. That is the Renown cycle. I cannot recommend it to you highly enough. And then when you're done with the Renown cycle, then I would recommend moving on to Ride the High Country, which is Randolph Scott's adios to basically to filmmaking, to being an actor. And it is so where the Buddecker films are really boots on the ground, cowboy stories, good versus evil versus gray. Actually, there's not a whole lot of good versus evil as much as it's gray versus gray. And that's kind of what makes those movies interesting, is that there's lines are not easily drawn. Morality is not easily identified among some of these characters. And you're like, well, this person's very evil, but, it's less white hat, black hat, and just a lot of gray hats. And that gets transferred into this movie, which is kind of by the 60s. What movie, or what year is this? This is 1962. And by the way, this was directed by Sam Peckinpah, who would later go on to do The Wild Bunch, which is another one of those highly respected Westerns that we're not talking about in this video, but Sam Peckinpah. And Peckinpah brought that realism to his Western stuff. He wrote for, there's a ton of 50s Western TV shows that Sam Peckinpah wrote for. And he brought the humanity, the plight of the person, the struggle to these. And so Ride the High Country is really less about that epic Western landscape and riding off into the sunset, and more about struggling with your place in a changing world. And that's a theme that would continually pop up during the 60s and the 70s, as the classic Western heroes of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s were now, in their 60s and 70s, and they were looking back and who are we? What is the place for us in this world, this ever-changing world? Ride the High Country is the finish point for that. So start with 7 Men From Now, go through the Renown cycle, and then finish with Ride the High Country. And you will not be disappointed. So let's see, what do I have? What else do I have here? I will just say, as a if you want to explore more 50s Westerns, I would recommend maybe starting with something like this. You can get these multi-packs. Like, this is an official Universal DVD set, and it has 8 movies on it, and these are like sub $10. You can get a ton of movies for under $10. The gem on this set is this movie called Cuantas, and it's got Fred MacMurray, who Fred MacMurray, some noir films, but I think an entire generation knew him as the dad on My Three Sons. He's an absent-minded professor. He became like the family man, and in Cuantas, he's a real piece of work. So Cuantas is one of those movies that I never had even heard of and I never seen, and then this set comes along, and Cuantas had previously been issued in a on-demand presentation from Universal, like a burned on demand kind of a thing. But that's the thing about this set too, is that it takes some things that had not had proper pressed Blu-ray editions, and they include them here. And this is a 2-disc set. But these movies are short. They look good on this set. So Cuantas is one of those. But check out 50s Westerns. The 50s really were the heyday of the American Western, because it was just that point in time for whatever reason. Like, we can look at certain things and be like, well, this was the decade for this. The 50s and the Western were just made to be together. The technology had just reached a certain point. The storytelling ability had reached a certain point. So we're talking about very serious, oftentimes very serious, very epic, very majestic westerns, but the writers were also, World War II was in the rear view, so there was this like anger, maybe this questioning of who are we, how did we get here, where are we going. All those things get tied up into these 50s westerns, and that was also, the heyday of noir. Noir from post World War II through the 50s. So that whole mentality, you see a lot of crossover between noir and the westerns of the 50s. But I guess I'm gonna talk about, let's see, let's go spaghetti. You guys want to go spaghetti for a few minutes? So around the 60s, around the time of Ride the High Country, the American Western is in decline. Partly because of television, because you could turn on your TV and you could see Rawhide or Gunsmoke or Have Gun Will Travel. The Western really moved out of the cinema and into homes in the late 50s through the early to mid 60s. So there was less reason. And Peckinpah, I told you Peckinpah was writing for these TV shows. So the talent was there too. A lot of the great, the creator of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry, did a lot of work on Have Gun Will Travel. So it was moving, it was migrating, and the movies were kind of this different thing at that point. So the Italians had been influenced by all these American Westerns. And so they kind of started to make their own. And you filter that American myth through the Italian. Listen, these guys created opera, right? So it's this huge operatic, they're pop operas is what I call them. And that's what they are. The guitars, the pop music, the twangy, jangly, all that stuff really gets recreated into something entirely unique. And of course, Clint Eastwood went to Italy to make, the Leone, the Once Upon a Time, not once, the Man with No Name trilogy. We're talking about A Fistful of Dollars for a few dollars more, and the iconic The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which we are not going to talk about in this video. But I want to talk about Sergio Corbucci, because he made Django in 66. Is this 66? Let me double check myself. Yes, 1966. And then in 1967, he made Navajo Joe with Burt Reynolds. But Django is one of those that of course, now Quentin Tarantino has made a Django movie, so more people are aware of Django. But Django is one of those series that it was so successful that there are dozens of Django movies that have nothing to do with this character, because it just became a brand. It became an Italian spaghetti western brand. Oh, well, we'll just call this a Django movie, and people come see it. But Franco Nero, who is a wonderful Italian actor, shows up in this town dragging a coffin. And what's in the coffin? And so for the whole movie, he's dragging this coffin around. And then, there's a formula to spaghetti westerns, more or less. There's the hero rides into town. The town doesn't trust them. Hero inserts himself usually into this precarious situation where he's oftentimes playing two sides. Hero gets caught. Hero often gets tortured. Hero, maybe I should say anti-hero, because the Italian Western heroes were normally kind of scummy. They were not necessarily noble, but they had a code that they lived by. But then he frees himself. He escapes, and then we find out what's in that coffin, and it is cool. And so Django was Sergio Corbucci's, I think it's his best, let me think about this. It's one of my favorite Corbucci films. Corbucci is often not, in spaghetti westerns, they teach, like when you learn about spaghetti westerns, it's like, well, you teach Sergio Leone. There are a ton of other guys, the Ringo films, the Sartana films, the Sabata films, but Corbucci really had a handle on it. I think he was right under Leone as far as the pedigree of what he was doing, what he was creating. And then that movie was successful, and so a year later, he got the opportunity to make Navajo Joe with Burt Reynolds. And Burt Reynolds, like I've got Burt Reynolds' book, it's his autobiography, and I don't think he really is proud, or was, rest in peace Burt Reynolds, I don't think that he was proud of Navajo Joe, but I like it a lot. I think it's really good, and it's Sergio Corbucci. This is one of those, it's bigger than Django. It feels a little bit more, I don't want to say Hollywood, it just feels a little more polished. It's got a star in it, it's got that American star. It's Burt Reynolds. And check out the artwork for this. Is that not Is that not fantastic? So for the longest time, Navajo Joe was one of those movies that you would have to find in a multi-pack with something else, and it, you know, this budget, you get $5 for 5 movies or something like that, and it was always full frame, and it always looked beat up and stretched or smushed or whatever. And so this comes from Kino Lorber, and this is a beautiful HD proper aspect ratio presentation of Sergio Corbucci's Navajo Joe. I also want to talk about I have this triple pack, which is Hondo and True Grit, but the one I want to talk about is Once Upon a Time in the West, because that's the movie. I don't think it's less respected than Sergio Leone's Man with No Name trilogy, but I do think that it's less known. Not to say that it's obscure, because I think tons of people know about Once Upon a Time in the West. But I also wanted to talk about it because that's the one, for the longest time, me personally, I knew. So I started with Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in the 90s, I think, like when I was first coming to explore older film, when I was getting past that, like, movies older than me, why? When I first started to explore cinema history, started with The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, and then I got For a Fistful of Dollars, and then For a Few Dollars More, and then I came to Once Upon a Time in the West kind of later than that. And I did not like it. That's the thing I wanted to tell you guys. I did not like it because it was long. And I felt like Sergio Leone had learned all the wrong lessons from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Because for a fistful of dollars is kind of a tight story that doesn't meander too much. And then For a Few Dollars More, a little bit more meandering. And then by the time of The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, it's like this 3-hour epic masterpiece sort of a thing where we're just existing and Once Upon a Time in the West is that same kind of thing. It's a very long movie. It doesn't necessarily feel focused, but over time, I have really come to appreciate that maybe Once Upon a Time in the West is Sergio Leone's best movie. And that's really saying something, given what I just told you. And I know how iconic Clint Eastwood is with a little rolled cigar in his mouth, shifting it around from side to side and squinting. But Once Upon a Time in the West, I think, is probably a better movie. Again, I know that's controversial, but it's got Henry Fonda in it. It has Jason Robards and Charles Bronson in a really good role. The harmonica, there's a harmonica motif. By the way, Ennio Morricone did the music for Once Upon a Time in the West, and it is the themes of these characters, that harmonica music really gets woven into the plot of the film. It's really, really fantastic. So if you guys haven't seen that one, go for it, because it's one of the best. Let's see, how much more? I'm really trying to decide how deep we want to go. The Clint Eastwood movie that I want to talk to you guys about is Two Mules for Sister Sarah. This is one that I think it flies under a lot of radars, but this is one of my favorite Clint Eastwood westerns. Look, I love the Man with No Name movies, the Leone movies that we're talking about, but I also think that this movie, made by Universal, this is a studio picture back. So here's what happens. So Clint Eastwood, after Rawhide, goes to make these Italian westerns, and they don't hit in America. We don't get them in America for a few years. So he comes back and he starts doing these other things, and then they blow up in America. And then American studios are trying to replicate the success of the spaghetti westerns from a few years before. And then we get things like this. This always seems to happen. It happens with blaxploitation movies. This movement occurs independently from the studio system, and then the studio system's like, let's do that, and then they chase that trend. It's always been like this. We see this now, like, well, this Marvel movie is successful, let's make 100 more movies like this. But it's always been like that. Studios look for what's successful. But this comes from that period when the studio system was making spaghetti western style movies that weren't actually spaghetti westerns. They were made by American filmmakers. This is Don Siegel. Clint Eastwood loved Don Siegel. He kind of learned at the tree of Don Siegel, the foot of Don, I don't know, whatever. Don Siegel was like a mentor for Clint Eastwood, and they did a lot of stuff together. But this is, it's not a spaghetti western, but it feels like a spaghetti western, but with American production values. And so it is Clint Eastwood, Shirley MacLaine. The conceit is that she's a nun, but there's a secret, and it is funny, and it's full of action, and the climax is them just like lighting dynamite and throwing it at people. And it's fantastic, and it's one of those that, you know, I think Quentin Tarantino put part of the score for this in Django Unchained. So it is loved by at least some other people, but that's always been one of the ones that I've always connected with. Two Mules for Sister Sarah. You know what? I'm going to do one more, and then we'll save the rest for another video, because it's gone long enough, probably. I want to talk about how Westerns are not necessarily limited to period. It does not have to be told in the 1800s, the 1860s, or the 1890s. And a perfect example of this is a movie that's directed by John Sturges. I think it's one of his greatest films. It's Bad Day at Black Rock. So this is, as you can see, it's got Spencer Tracy. He's got a briefcase. He's wearing a suit. This is not a period film. This takes place, this was made in the 50s. Let me see exactly what. This is 1954, and it takes place in 1954. So there's cars. There's, you know, we see a lot of this now. I would say that No Country for Old Men is a Western, and I would say, you know, Hell or High Water is a Western. But this is classic Western formula, but without the trappings of saloons and spittoons. Actually, those things are still in this movie, but it's just set in a more modern time, with telephones and with the radio and stuff like that. And what this movie does in its relatively brief running time, this is an 81-minute movie, is it tells this super intense, very powerful, very violent story about this town called Black Rock, this place where Spencer Tracy gets off the train. He comes into this town, and it all goes down. Just over the next day or so, it just goes down really sour. It all goes bad. And we're finding out more about who he is, who the town is. This town has a secret. What is the secret? Why does this town not want this man here? And why are they so prepared to kill him to protect their secret? And I will tell you no more, because I realize this is probably one of those that a lot of you guys haven't seen. So Bad Day at Black Rock is a fantastic movie. So that we'll call it a day for the Westerns. There's so much more. I still have these to talk about, but we'll save them for another time, because I want to keep doing this and encourage conversation and interaction. So guys, that's going to do it for our look at Westerns, I guess volume 1. And we'll come back here and pick up a volume 2 down the road. Give me some feedback. I want to know what you guys think about this video, what you think about some of these movies. If you're intrigued by this conversation about them and you want to check them out, if you do check them out, I want your feedback. I'm telling you guys, I want to know if you watch a movie because I tell you that it's good and then you go watch it. I want to know what you think about it. I want your take on it. So engage in the comments below. I don't care if it's been a year. If you're watching this video 5 years after I made this video, I don't care. Leave a comment. I will still see it and I will still engage with you, because I want to share this love that I have of Westerns with you guys. So that's going to do it. Thank you very much for hanging out with me and talking about the American genre of Westerns. Take care. Until next time, I do appreciate you very much. So take care. And until next time, I will catch you later.